All right, mic check. Yeah, perfect. Hello, everybody. Pardon? Thank you. All right, so folks, everyone in this room has heard of GraphQL. We saw that at the keynote, and they said about 50% of people in the entire conference have got GraphQL in production. I would be surprised to find if in this entire conference about 5% of the audience have actually contributed to GraphQL, the language, or some of its larger ecosystem. And so what I'd like to try and do is sort of pull the curtains back on what it looks like to be contributing at that level and try and understand how all the systems come together and help you actually do it yourself. So to do that, we're going to split it into three major sections. There is how is GraphQL structured, like organizational and bureaucratically. What the process for change looks like inside GraphQL. And then finally, how can you get involved? And a lot of the way in which we think of GraphQL is this sort of language entity, but the vast majority of it is about the spec. And I'm sure you'll have heard about the spec in a few different places, but we're going to talk about it in quite a depth here. So to get started, this is me. You've already heard my intro. I did indeed work on the Prettier redesign, the React Native redesign, and the Jest redesign quite recently. And I've been pitching to the Babel team that this should be the new Babel logo. I know, right? Isn't it so cute? This year I managed to ship a really popular game. 20 million games were played on this. It's like Flappy Royale meets it's like Flappy Bird meets a Battle Royale. But in the open source world, I've been doing things like running a dependency manager for iOS. I built a tool called Danger, which makes it easy for you to start making sort of unit test rules for your pull requests. So let's say you always have to, one of the rules we had was at Artsy, whenever we made a change to a GraphQL schema, you had to also make sure that a GraphQL schema file was in the root of every single repo. And so Danger would check that any PR that made changes to the schema also included a text change to the SDL at the bottom, because we were kind of a code-first schema at the time. And now I work on TypeScript, which is something that has come up in almost every single talk that I've attended here. And it seems like lots of people love it and use it in the GraphQL community. And that makes tons of sense. Types on one side, types on the other side. You get a really nice tight connection between how all the pieces come together. So I work on TypeScript as a compiler engineer, but I'm here at a GraphQL conference. And you'd be shocked to learn that we don't actually use GraphQL in TypeScript at all. A lot of my experiences for what we're going to be talking about actually come from the place I used to work at. And that was a place called Artsy. And the goal of Artsy was to make it easy to buy and sell fine art on the internet. And it's pretty much achieved that in the past 7 or 8 years that I was working there. And we had this one single GraphQL instance that we started back in 2015. And this GraphQL instance really made it easy for us to start adopting GraphQL at quite a large scale on both a React Native app and a web app. And we ended up doing the sort of, we ended up making a sort of API gateway, which worked out really well for us. We also explored stitching. You can see here, this is like some custom developer tooling that we used in the sort of extensions part of the JSON. It would tell you every single request that was made for your API. This one is our main artist database, and then this one is our main articles database. And you could see which ones take longest or did different parts of the system. And we use GraphQL to provide both a single entry point to all of our different APIs, but as well as to provide derived data on top of the sort of raw data that we get back from a database. And so this is the sort of place where we were over the course of a few years. We as Artsy were trying to contribute back to the GraphQL ecosystem either by helping to improve tooling or trying to persuade people to support certain things. We were trying to figure out GraphQL subscriptions at the same time as everybody else was, and had our own stab and attempt at what that looked like, but it didn't turn into the actual spec version. So now my version of subscriptions is, in my mind, is very different from actual reality. So we ended up contributing to GraphQL a few times, and in the process of that, it felt like to understand how to contribute to GraphQL at an ecosystem level, you really had to understand how GraphQL is structured. And one way to really, really learn this is to have a tiny bit of history from me, but you should actually go and watch this documentary. And this year, around June, there was a GraphQL, the documentary video that came out on YouTube. It's solid. I would strongly recommend it. It's like half an hour, and it really describes like from 0 to maybe the end of 2018, like the history of GraphQL, how it was created, why it was created, and what motivations they see going forwards. So roughly, created in 2012 by Dan Schaefer, Nick Schrock, and Lee Byron. And they were trying to address data handling within a native app. And then in 2015, it was sort of released to the public. And it was released to the public in a way that was a little bit unique at the time, which is instead of releasing, a reference implementation and saying this is what it is, they instead said this is a specification for GraphQL, a query language, and here is how responses work, and here's how requests generally work. So by shipping a query, by shipping a specification, that gave them the ability to actually start saying, we only care about this aspect of a query language and the way in which data can be transformed between these two things. The actual implementations of it are something that we as Facebook engineers at the time are not actually going to be providing for you. We're trying to provide a way for people to build this thing in the future, but not necessarily to be the ones to provide the exact implementation. At the time, the version that is now GraphQL.js was effectively a way to prove that the spec was doable, and that it was expected that the community would find its own implementations. And there are now many implementations of GraphQL. There was some talks on the C# one, the Rust one, and the Java one, whatever. There's a lot of them. And all these people tend to come together and sort of band around what the spec looks like and see that evolve over time. So this actually echoes JavaScript quite a lot. There is a JavaScript spec that many different language implementers all also sort of conform to, and they all agree on what JavaScript looks like, and then each one implements their own version of the JavaScript spec. And in the case of JavaScript, not everyone conforms to the exact same spec, but in GraphQL, almost every language has almost every single feature that comes inside the spec. So from shipping the spec over the course of the last few years, there's a great quote in the documentary from Lee that says, we saw GraphQL go from being used by a few hobbyists to being used by companies to being used as an industry standard. And each one of those has sort of different levels of sort of process required to actually make changes work, and also they have different areas of sort of political friction. And to start thinking of GraphQL as an industry standard, they really had to start changing what GraphQL, the sort of organizational structure, looked like. And back when it was just a few companies and hobbyists, it was OK for Facebook to be in control of almost all of the spec and have very tight, rigid control over it. But in order to be a collaborative environment where many people could feel like they felt some ownership over the process, and in order to actually be an industry standard, Facebook needed to find a way to decouple themselves from being the owners of GraphQL to moving it into a sort of industry standard that is not directly tied to Facebook. And so the process in which they did that happened in 2008, and it was done by sort of first moving GraphQL into the Linux Foundation, and then secondly starting to work with the Joint Development Foundation. So what is the Linux Foundation? It is roughly a build a foundation as a service. The people that built Linux effectively wanted to sort of make sure that many people could be involved in the Linux process and could sort of centralize funding and try and find ways to get people paid to work on Linux correctly. And then the same sort of problem meant that other communities would need that same sort of infrastructure. So what's quite common in JavaScript is that there is an OpenJS foundation, and and like projects like jQuery or Dojo or Grunt or Node all live inside this foundation, not necessarily owned by any one single company, but owned by a collection of companies that pay membership fees that helps to go towards the maintenance of all of these kind of core libraries and tools. And quite reasonably, the creators of GraphQL wanted that for GraphQL. Like, to make it an industry standard, you need a lot of people to feel involved in the process. And by doing that, then everybody could feel like it wasn't just a singular Facebook project. So after the Linux Foundation got started with GraphQL, they created what is now called the GraphQL Foundation. And that is sort of effectively the service that Linux Foundation provided for GraphQL, the sort of data language. And that has two people effectively on the board, which is Lee Byron, one of the original creators, and Brian Warner, who comes from the Linux Foundation to sort of provide like experience and sort of provide a bunch of useful advice as the program director. They do things like trying to map the GraphQL landscape. This came out this week. And it's a sort of work-in-progress tool that shows you almost everyone that's actually involved in the sort of GraphQL ecosystem and tries to give you an understanding at a high level how all these pieces and people come together to actually make GraphQL a successful thing. And this is like still a work in progress. So if you actually go and check this out and you find that your company's not on there, they definitely accept pull requests with new people that should be added to it. And because the GraphQL Foundation is a true foundation with many members paying members fees, it actually means that we're starting to see, as of like this month, people starting to actually get paid to do maintenance work for like GraphQL's related repos. And this is awesome. Effectively, you have these membership fees that give you access to being on the foundation, and the foundation has extra sort of meetings that give people the chance to sort of have very high-level discussions that are separate from the working groups that we'll get to. And as well, they get to choose where the budget goes to every single month. So with a foundation setup that allows like sort of the political power of GraphQL to be split across many different sort of companies and organizations, then there needed to be a way to sort of handle a lot of the legal and bureaucratic problems. Problems is not the right word. You needed some way to handle bureaucracy when you're trying to deal with this many like contracts for members' fees and things like that. And so the Linux Foundation works with the Joint Development Foundation, which again is a service now for bureaucracy. So effectively, they make it easier for you to have to handle all the legalese necessary to run a 503c, so a nonprofit legally. And so this is a bureaucracy as a service kind of tool that the GraphQL team use. I know, right? OK, so that is roughly all of the different organizations that live at like the highest level of the GraphQL ecosystem. So that's how all this stuff comes together. So from there, how does a change happen? So one way to think about it is like what is owned by GraphQL, the sort of organizational structure, and like how do changes happen within that ecosystem. The GraphQL org runs a few things. We talked about the spec already. There's the reference implementations for data loader and GraphQL.js. And then there's GraphiQL. And then there's also the branding and the websites and the landscape documents that we saw earlier. There's also two working groups, a GraphQL working group and a GraphiQL working group, or graphical. I'll probably call it both. And each of those have working group agendas. So every month, roughly, there is a working group for GraphQL. And every 2 months, roughly, there's a working group for GraphiQL. And this is like a very low process setup for a working group. It's basically a GitHub repo that you can follow. You can just like watch the repo, and you'll always get up to date with what's going on at like high levels of GraphQL. And it's all very readable, understandable Markdown. It's very free of like jargon that you might not understand because of the layers of bureaucracy that should exist. One of the good things about these working groups is that they have like guidelines on how to participate. I know the first time I attended, I was really glad to be able to know that I was actively encouraged to not talk too much. you come in, you put yourself on the agenda, and you wait until it's that time, unless you have some very strong feedback. Yeah, the participation guidelines are definitely worth a read. I'll leave those as these for now, but they're more in depth on the actual website. And then there's an RFC process, which feels very close to how TC39 works in JavaScript. So you may have heard, for example, one of the things we're very excited on the TypeScript team is that the question mark dot operator managed to make it in to stage 3. And what that means is that it's gone through enough stages of proposals towards getting into the spec that the same system actually works quite well here, although there are a few differences because of the size of the projects. So the 4 main ones are the straw person. So that's the idea that you're going to pitch something, and at this point you just expect people to be knocking it down and trying it up again and trying to get a new idea out. So this really could just be as simple as a GitHub issue or a tweet or something like that that just sort of gets the idea out to people. From there, you go to a proposal, and this is where you have a little bit of process. You have to decide someone that's going to champion it, and it must have a compelling case. It must be well thought out by this point. That people have tried to look at it from different perspectives. And ideally, you should start thinking about making pull requests to either the reference implementation or maybe the spec. Then there's the draft, where it's you're going to be using the correct syntax and the correct formalization inside the spec, because the spec is a language spec. So there are parts of it that are very human readable, but then there are parts of it that are literally meant to be sort of machine readable as well too. So you would learn to do that, and maybe you would have your own fork of GraphiQL or something to try it out with. And then accepted means what it means, which means that it will go into the spec and will be released on the next spec release. There's a talk of moving spec releases to be an annual release. So once a year, then all of the accepted RFCs will get put into a single spec, and then that will move on. And so you will say that the GraphQL for JavaScript library supports 2020, version 2020 of the spec. Whereas the unmaintained version of the OCaml GraphQL only supports version 2019 version of the spec. So you can have an understanding of what language features will be supported by knowing which versions of the specs it supports. So there's also being rejected, which not every idea gets through, and that's totally OK. So from there are a set of guiding principles. I mean, if something gets rejected, you kind of want to know up front whether something's going to actually make it through the process. And these are the guiding principles of GraphQL full stop. So backwards compatibility is a pretty solid one. You make a query. You expect that query to continue to work in the future, even though the spec has changed. Performance is a feature. Is don't make GraphQL slower. By introducing new language features or things that are very hard to parse. Opt to say no in terms of changes, because just like with JavaScript, GraphQL has a ton of implementations in a ton of different languages, and if you can't agree on a specific choice, you should not agree. You should not make that in the spec until it's 100% certain on every single person's mind in the working groups. Enable new capabilities motivated by new cases is actually, you have to not just say this conceptually is a good idea. You need to come to these, create RFCs with real use cases in mind and try and use those to say I do this and I can use this feature, and if I do that, then this can happen. And putting these in terms of real world use cases makes things a lot easier for everybody to reason about. Simplicity and consistency over expressiveness and terseness. This is a lot like when you talk about code. Most of the time code is read and not wrote, so you should spend your time making the GraphQL language favor simplicity over very fancy syntax that allows for additional, for many different behaviors. And then preserve option values is a nice way of saying make GraphQL easy to change in the future. You don't want to be making language decisions that force a particular sort of syntax down the line or a particular type of response down the line when you want to make it easy to change. And then finally, understandability is important as correctness. So this is actually about the spec. And in terms of writing the details in the spec, you should try and favor human readability over like perfect technical correctness, because ideally a lot of people should be able to read the spec and understand what GraphQL is at a fundamental level. Whew. OK, so how can you get involved? A lot of open source is generally, I make a pull request, eventually someone merges it, and that's great life. Because there's a bit more process here, it's worth going over this process, but it's not considerably different. So we're going to use my most recent example from this year, which was I had an idea, and I thought, you know what? I don't think it's a great idea that people keep having to fork GraphQL or using a different implementation of GraphQL like Altair or GraphQL Playgrounds, when GraphQL is a great base for building things on. So I pitched in a tweet that we should actually start thinking about GraphQL 2, and that the GraphQL 2 should be a plugin infrastructure so that people that want to innovate can innovate, but the rest of us all get sort of shared infrastructure that everyone works on. And so I used that for my straw man and had people back and forthing on what that looks like. I tried to provide a very low fidelity image so people wouldn't start fighting about whether it should be pink or green or whatever. And then I took it to a working group. And so I sent a pull request to an existing working group, like I have done a few times before. You just send it in, and you just write my name, the agenda item, how long you think it should take. And then you should ideally be there to pitch it. In this case, I actually forgot to go. So luckily for me, there were other people at that meeting that were like, this is a good idea. And I will take that up and champion it. And so in my case, I looked out, and Ricky Shoot, shout out if you're watching, has been doing a lot of great work on sort of bringing GraphQL up to a point where it can start thinking about some of these redesigns and plugging infrastructure. But now there is a champion for that idea, and it is starting to get there. So from there, we effectively achieved consensus that GraphQL should, first of all, just have its own working group. And that's actually the first action item that came from that, was to start allowing GraphQL to have its own working group with its own infrastructure to start talking about these problems. And so from there, we started building out issues and discussed it on the GraphQL infrastructure, like the GraphQL repo, and started just trying to figure out what that could both look like technically and what it could look like aesthetically. So effectively, what you see here is this period where nothing was happening on GraphQL for multiple years, and then you can see us just starting to pick up pace towards the end. And that was entirely formed from that one working group that I completely missed. Yes. So if you're interested in contributing to GraphQL at some of these ecosystem level problems, then first of all, you can cheat, and you can just help us out on GraphQL. You can just start doing that today. If you want to do that, there's a big roadmap right now that sort of teaches you where we want to take it and what all the pieces are. If you have React and JavaScript experience, which I bet the majority of the people in this room do, then all you really need to do is look at the roadmap and come join us in the GraphQL Slack. We'd love to see GraphQL be the sort of foundation for tools like the OneGraph Explorer that we'll hopefully see later, the Playground, sort of tools that everybody wants to see in different places. And the idea is by splitting it out, then you can build that, and we can just focus on building a really solid IDE-like experience for your GraphQL queries. And realistically, the final one is actually Persevere. I've attended 3 working groups and got consensus on 3 separate things that are agreed and done. The trade-off has been that not one of these things has been merged yet, so I've managed to get them all the way to the code and agreed, but I've still not managed to actually get some of these things in. And that's actually OK, in my opinion. As a high-level open source contributor, I really want to stress the idea that everybody involved at the high levels is either doing it in their spare time and shouldn't feel pressure to actually keep doing some of this work, but that people care. And Lee, who's probably out there in the audience, still knows that he owes me an action item adding me to the GraphQL website, but maybe that'll get done one day. But it's all about trying to help each other, and perseverance and reminding people about these things is also a very big positive. So that was me. I tried to give you an overview of the different parts of the GraphQL organization, the sort of process that is required to actually contribute, and then the sort of projects that you could contribute if you don't want to go through that process because we've already got through that process. There's a lot of constant evolution in the GraphQL ecosystem, and if you just follow the GraphQL working group repo, you'll keep on top of a lot of it too. And that makes your life easier, and it makes everyone else's lives easier. And I'd love to see more people contribute to GraphQL because I think it's a really cool industry standard, and I want to see it win. So thank you, everyone.